Goblins are everyone's favourite mischievous, big-nosed, greedy, gold-hoarding creatures. Okay, so maybe not everyone's favourite set of creatures, but I like them, and that's why it's almost impossible to avoid them in modern fantasy. Because just like filthy sewer rats, they're absolutely everywhere. In books, in movies, in games. If there is gold or treasure, then there is probably an ugly little green man telling you that time is money, friend. There are few things you could do that are worse than creating goblins. Goblins are dumb, excitable, cowardly, and dangerous beings with very little instinct for their self-preservation and no regard for any other creatures other than themselves, not even other goblins. Before we get into the DM toolkit, the physical, behavioural and social observations, I wanted to share with you some of my kind of couple of clips of goblins being used in Dungeons and Dragons.
Most of my kind, the goblins that live in the storm wall closest to the valley, they've been slowly, their minds falling apart. Obviously, a goblin of my intellect has kept it intact. Certainly not mad. But the others, they're more simple than I am. They've slowly begun to unwind, you see.
Yeah.
Useful for my purposes.
Did you know Smeek before the madness?
No. What are you implying that all goblins know each other?
No, because you've been working together.
No. I found most of these cretins scavenging, looting, eating their own filth.
Nice.
I put them to better uses. This will simply be the beginnings of an empire.
And the
Make do with what tools you have, as I am often told by my ancestors.
I wouldn't call people tools.
He gestures to the goblins do you really see these cretins as anything more than a tool? Look at this, look at them. And they are pretty dim-witted. They're scratching their butts, picking their nose, they're holding pickaxes and licking them. They look savage. They've lost their minds, most of them. One of them is just sat on the floor looking down at the ground.
Thanks for that.
That's what he's doing.
Accurate representation of Mark's day.
Yeah.
Smeek is particularly scarred. Out of all the goblins, they all are pretty scarred. Some of them have these patterns where it looks like they've been struck by lightning and it's kind of gone down their body and they've survived. These kind of scarred, beautiful spiderweb patterns along their kind of orangey, greenish skin. Smeek looks particularly scarred. He has, looks like he's had deep cuts in him at one point. An arrow has been stuck into his chest that has been healed over. He has his back is just covered in this scarred pattern, this lightning scar pattern. But he just looks over with these kind of manic, rotten brown teeth in a big grin. And he comes over and he's holding what appears to be a broken bracer. And he's like, nah.
How very kind, thank you. That's lovely.
He's a good host. At the very least.
He's very good with people.
What? Sorry? Gas. Yeah?
He's pointing at me again.
I don't speak
Does
Goblin.
anybody know
Sorry,
what
kid.
he's saying? Because he's pointing at me and it's kind of weird.
He's babbling nonsense, speaking about you being part of the storm, and you all here to bring him his I'm trying to think of the word in common, glorious death.
Behavioural observations. I always see goblins as an entire race of tiny green down on their luck rogues that are consistently looking for a new way to change their fortune in whatever way they can, and then duck out when things just get that little bit too dangerous for them to be around. The goblins in Harry Potter are slightly different in terms of being sly and calculated, but they still have that very stereotypical give me all your gold vibe to them. I mean, a bunch of them working in the bank counting gold all day. In books and movies, you see and hear that the goblins are being bullied by bigger and stronger creatures, and I like to think that's taught goblins how to exploit what few advantages they had, namely their sheer numbers. They favoured ambushes, overwhelming odds, dirty tricks and other edges that they could devise, the concept of a fair fight being meaningless in their society. After a year or so, a goblin reaches adulthood and is a full-fledged terror in its own right. It will steal, kill, or starve. It will exert dominance over anything weaker than it, and it will kill anything it doesn't find useful or entertaining. Goblins are clumsy and stupid things, and are prone to a manner of different accidents. Now add a crude or faulty grenade, and then you can definitely have some fun. Despite their generally poor reputation, however, not all goblins were or are dim-witted or evil. Some goblins have risen to become heroes, gaining enough renown to be accepted into the civilized world of another, or commonly good races. Social observations of the goblin. Goblins have existed all around the world for hundreds of years, going by many different names across Europe, that all sounded very similar to the term that we use today, but different in the way that it was spelt. The Latin gobble and the Greek gobblers. On the screen now you'll see a few different ways that the goblin has been spelt across Europe. Goblins are herd monsters and follow the pack in all things. A lone goblin is either a problem, and a bigger problem is the alpha goblin. Both are rushed to be killed or beaten, and if this assault fails, then you know which kind of goblin you've got on your hands. Alphas are smarter, well, relatively smarter. They have a focus it takes to keep the pack of raving lunatics from blowing everyone up. And if all else fails, they have the muscle and the will to cave in every last skull that doesn't get with the programme. Few blights upon the world have as many teeth, knives and explosives as a goblin. The gender roles of goblin society had the dominant male sustain the community through raiding and stealing, sneaking into lairs or villages, and even towns by night to take what they could. Goblin females, meanwhile, were expected to birth as many children as possible to sustain a population consistently driven down by violence. Many goblins who left for a life among other races were females, driven away by the structured role they were expected to play. Goblin females care for their young until they're a few months old and they can move and hunt for bugs on their own, at which point they are thrown into what are little more than large holding pens to grow strong and play. Such games as Kill the Weakling and What Does This Do? Young goblin mortality is very high, but this weeds out the inferior specimens. Physical observations. Goblins are small, black-hearted humanoids that lair in despoiled dungeons and other dismal settings. Individually weak, they gather in large number to torment other creatures. When you hear goblin, we all have the same image and voice that pops into our head. The Dungeon Master's Toolkit. Goblins are cheap, they're easy, and they remain very dangerous. As a low CR creature that can adapt and stay a threat, probably up until mid-range levels, they can be deployed alone or in a horde, with jobs varying from scouts, workers, thieves, marauders, assassins and shamans. I especially like goblins because I can flood a combat with them, give them a single hit point, and have my PCs slay them, leaving behind fistfuls of daggers, blood, guts everywhere. Goblins are flawed beings, meant for a single purpose, and getting them to do anything else is a hassle. So, happy hunting, stealing, maiming, overpopulating, and devouring.